few people are still popping in, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. We've got a lot of great information to cover this morning, a lot of learning and opportunity for question and answer as well. And again, I'm Meredith Berger. I'm the Director of Existing Industry Economic Development for the Greensboro Chamber. My focus is you, our existing companies. So I always encourage you, as Brad did, to reach out to me anytime for questions, resources, contacts. Of course, expansions, we really like those as well. So please feel free to reach out anytime. We'd like to welcome you to the Manufacturing Council and Supply Chain and Logistics Council this morning. We've combined these two council meetings due to the nature of this topic and its importance to all industries. A few announcements before we kick off our subject, which is mandating vaccinations at work, those legal considerations. We have, I know important to all is workforce, so we have Guilford Works career fair and hiring event coming up on October 13th at the Greensboro Coliseum. And you can stay tuned to get more information about that. They have not sent information out yet, but I'll be glad to share. And also Guilford Tech Business and Computer Technologies Career Fair on October 20th from 1 to 3 at the Jamestown Medlin campus. And that will cover a number of industries from IT to cybersecurity to supply chain, opportunities for students to engage with you for careers. I will also share, I already shared that one, but we'll share it again before the event. September 23rd at 11 a.m., I am doing another council meeting for us. This one will bring back Dr. Van from Guilford County Public Health and Hattie Gawande from the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services to update us as we move into the fall on any COVID-related or vaccine-related information and guidance for employers, again, as we move into the fall season. So be on the lookout for that invitation. This meeting stemmed from me viewing the Ramseur Maultsby blog post on LinkedIn. I saw this article that Alex had written back in July about mandating vaccines, and I thought that this would be a subject that's maybe slightly unknown to some, hopefully a learning experience for you all. And I also know they're going to touch base on current vaccination requests from employees, communication with employees on vaccinations and legal guidance there. And just wanted to introduce our speakers today. This is an extremely important topic. I know we have lots of interest in the topic, and I do ask that we love your questions. So please put those in the chat as we move forward. Or if you'd like to wait till the end of the presentation, that will be fine as well. And if we happen to run out of time, feel free to email me questions and I will make sure to get you connected over to Ramseur Maultsby. So without further ado, Patti Ramseur and Alex Maultsby practiced together for nearly 20 years at Smithmore Leatherwood here in Greensboro, focusing on employment law for employers. Smithmore Leatherwood became Fox Rothschild in 2018. And in 2020, Patti and Alex started their own firm here in town, Ramseur Maultsby LLP, where they continue to do the same work, advising companies in this area and beyond on how to manage tricky HR issues, representing companies and defending agency investigations and all sorts of employment litigation, and generally trying to help companies to stay out of trouble. Patti and Alex have worked with hundreds of local employers over the years, perhaps some of you, and they are regularly ranked by super lawyers and by Legal Elite for employment law in North Carolina. And actually, super lawyers this year named Patti Ramseur one of the top 10 lawyers in the entire state. They are true North Carolinians. I love it. Patti graduated from NC State and then went to law school at Wake Forest. Alex went to Davidson College and UNC Law School. Despite all of that, they somehow still get along and work together. So can't wait to hear from them this morning. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Patti Ramseur and Alex Maultsby.
Thank you, Meredith.
You're welcome.
Can everybody hear me okay? I know that if you can't, that's a weird request, but I see a couple nods, and so that's good enough. Thanks for that introduction. I don't know where you came up with all that. It doesn't sound like something that we would have sent to you to say about ourselves, but I love the award that Patti got last year. I mean, if you want to talk about coattails, I put that in everything that I ever send to anybody, that my law partner had such a fabulous rating. As Meredith mentioned, we did start our own firm about a year ago, and I will tell you, it was either crazy or brilliant. We're not sure which, because it has been bonkers in the world of HR management since, primarily related to COVID. And one of the things about employment law is that you get to a point in your career where mostly what you do is help your employees, your clients, talk about problem issues with their employees around laws that have largely been in place for a good while. And so what's new and different are the scenarios that pop up in all the different ways that human beings misbehave at work, and all the creative ways that employers, try to deal with that. But boy, in the last year, the law has not been static by any means. There have been lots of new regulations from the executive branch. There has been an overlay of federal rules and state rules and local rules, just something new and different every day. And the topic we're going to talk about today, falls into that category. There's never been, outside of maybe some sort of far off things, there's never been a time in history where employers, modern history, let's say, where employers have wanted to tell employees that they have to go do something that is semi-medical related, right? So we all know our kids have to get vaccines and immunizations. I have a rising high school senior who wants to play sports, and I had to get his physical form completed the other day, and they printed out his immunization record. And I will tell you, his immunization record was 2.5 pages. And I'm like, we just do that. We don't think about it. It's not a big deal. It's viewed as a sensible public health measure. But somehow, this thing, and, look, in part, it's because it's new and there's some element of a new technology, but primarily, it's because the whole shebang has been so politicized, and that's the world we live in these days, that everybody's got really strong opinions about this stuff. On top of that, of course, COVID has created a labor shortage, or some of the aspects of COVID seem to have led to that. And so you're talking about a situation that, we will acknowledge right off the bat is a world where it's difficult to impose on employees things that they don't want. And so, in North Carolina, that we generally follow the employment at will doctrine, which means that employees can quit if they want, but you can also pretty much, if you stay away from discrimination or retaliation laws, you can pretty much control the terms and conditions of employment. If you want to tell somebody they've got to do something, then they've got to do it, right? And you have the right to say, well, if you're not going to do what we tell you to do, then, within reason, you can't work here. That's fine, unless you don't have any employees, right? And so we know that tension exists, and that, as an overlay to this discussion about mandating vaccines, there's the actual reality that if you do, you may lose 20% of your workforce. So there's some practical considerations, and we'll talk about that. Patti and I work together a lot. We share client relationships. It is not my clients and her clients, it's our clients. And so we talk to each other literally every day. And generally speaking, when something thorny comes up, the first thing I do, or the first thing that she does, is call the other one of us and say, hey, what do you think about this? So we're going to kind of take that approach here, and I'm going to ask Patti all of the hard questions about this subject, and she's going to ask me all the easy questions about this subject, and we'll use that framework to sort of back and forth it and keep it going. Let's start with just a very big picture, Ms. Ramseur. So we know that, generally speaking, employers can mandate vaccines. That has become relatively clear, but there are exceptions to that. Broadly speaking, will you just kind of walk us through what those exceptions are, and then we can drill down maybe on some details about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that you owned this issue in our relationship, Alex, as you started this conversation. So I will definitely invite our participants to make sure they are sending all their difficult questions to you, so we can balance this out just a bit. But, as you can gather, you open, any news media, you look at this article, certainly there's a lot happening on the vaccine side. And I love the discussion as we were starting the call about incentives and incentives that companies may be offering. And, we've seen all this evolve, really quickly since the vaccines were approved earlier this year. So, we're going to continue to see this evolve. So even as we talk about, the ability to mandate vaccines and the exceptions to that, as we work through those issues and whether or not something qualifies as an exception, stay tuned, folks, because this is changing. And as we continue, on the legal side, as we continue on the business side, as businesses do different things, we are going to continue to see this evolve. And, Alex hit on this. Right now, it is fairly established. Employers can mandate vaccines. The EEOC has come out with guidance, and if you all have been looking at the EEOC's website through the last 3 to 6 months, you've seen the EEOC come out with this relatively short and sweet Q&A that's on its website. And as things have changed, the EEOC is updating that information. So mark that as a resource, so that if you have questions that arise relating to COVID testing, vaccines, all of these issues, the exceptions, that's a good starting point in looking at this. But employers—
Well, hey, let me jump in right there. We will send that page. I mean, it's probably readily findable, frankly, if you Google EEOC COVID vaccine accommodation, you'll probably get it, but we'll send that link to Meredith so she can spread it around. It's a long Q&A, but it gives a lot of good info. All right, that's all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it does take some time at this point because the Q&A has grown. But employers found some relief in that, right? We know what the EEOC is going to say about mandating vaccines because the EEOC has put that on its website, that you can do it. And the EEOC has also, clarified that, this doesn't mean our other laws don't still apply. So if we have a situation in which someone is requesting an accommodation due to a disability under the ADA, or we have an employee who is requesting a religious accommodation under Title VII. Those are the two exceptions where we are going to have to stop and do an analysis of whether or not we're going to need to provide an accommodation, which is basically a request that they not be required to take a mandatory vaccine if you're at that point. I think the other thing that's really interesting on that issue is while the vaccines were still in temporary authority, the Department of Justice weighed in on this issue toward the end of July and, likewise said, employers, you are allowed to mandate the vaccine. The fact that it's only been approved temporary status does not change that requirement. So I think as these things have happened and it's unfolded, we've definitely seen some additional employers sticking their toe in the water on this issue, whether it's incentives or mandatory vaccines.
All right, so let's talk about this a little bit. So we've got the right to require our employees to be vaccinated. Employees have the right to come forward and say, I've got a medical issue and my doctor says that I can't be vaccinated. Or somebody comes forward and says, as part of my religion, I believe that I ought not to do this. It violates my religious beliefs. Is that all they need to do? Or do they have to talk about proof and what that process looks like? Or you pick one and I'll do the other one, either way.
All right, you start with the ADA.
Okay,
and then I'll talk about Title VII.
All right, so let's talk about the ADA real quick. All right, we know that whenever we get around the topic of talking to employees about their medical condition, things get dicey. Okay, so first of all, let's just be clear that HIPAA, which people throw around all the time, is a law that applies to healthcare providers and to health insurance claims payers, whether they're the brokers or the third-party administrators or the insurance companies. That is all. HIPAA does not apply to employers. Employers can ask employees about their health condition all day long, every day. So asking somebody if they've been vaccinated does not violate HIPAA. Requiring that somebody tell you so that you can tell supervisors, it does not violate HIPAA for you to turn around and tell a supervisor. Frankly, it doesn't violate HIPAA for you to go call WFMY and say Meredith Barger either is or is not, right? You wouldn't do it, but it doesn't violate HIPAA. What's relevant is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which says that if you're going to do medical inquiries, that they've got to be what's called job related and consistent with business necessity. So a medical inquiry has to be job related. You can't just haul off and ask them something that doesn't matter for their job. And it's got to be consistent with business necessity. So even if it relates to the job, you've still got to have a good business reason to be asking the question. And that applies to questions that you ask people that might disclose or could tend to disclose the existence of a disability. So all this comes out of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which says, look, don't go around asking people if they're disabled, because that is going to do a couple things. It's going to give you information that they might actually turn around and use against you if you don't treat them right. They might say, well, it's because I told them that I was disabled and then look what happened. So some of this is to protect employers from themselves without poking around where they don't need to. The other piece of it is that you can't, so just lost my train of thought. So the other reason that this comes up in the vaccination context is that there's a question then, is asking somebody if they've been vaccinated this type of medical inquiry? And the EEOC has said, no, you can ask people about their vaccine status. It's not HIPAA, and it's not a medical inquiry under the ADA, okay? So just as an initial matter, we're free to talk to people about their beliefs around the ADA, around the vaccine. We're entitled to talk to people about whether or not they're vaccinated. So, then you got to consider, okay, well, that's fine, but is this going to bleed over from just that simple question about are you vaccinated into areas that I don't really want to be talking about, right? And you got to think about, who am I? So am I the HR person or the safety manager who's pretty well trained about this, or, is the frontline supervisor who might not be particularly trained about these issues? So if you think about going to somebody and saying, we need to take a poll on who's vaccinated and who's not, that can quickly turn into live in the moment discussions about why. And if you start asking the why question, or you've got a bunch of supervisors running around asking people, why, then you're going to get folks to say, well, it's because, and they may give you a disability related reason. Okay, so all this is without regard to mandating. This is just, we want to know who's vaccinated and who's not. And earlier when we were talking about that, I saw a lot of sort of furry eyebrows about, well, should we even be doing this? So just to set the stage, we can do that. All right, on the disability and the accommodation piece, somebody has to be disabled. They can't just go get a note from a doctor where the doctor says, well, it's my opinion that people ought not to have to be vaccinated. So to avoid the employer's vaccine mandate, you have to have a disability under the ADA, and you have to have a doctor say that because of your disability, you're not a candidate for the vaccination. We could talk for the rest of the day here, the rest of the hour here, about what is and isn't a disability under the ADA. But, most things that are really wrong with somebody, the definition has been expanded enough that most people who have some systemic health issue are going to be considered disabled. So you know, that's the thing. And so you've got to set up a process. If you mandate a vaccine, you've got to set up a process for people to raise their hand and say, I have a medical reason. And then just like you would under the ADA, if somebody came forward and said, I've got a 20-pound lifting restriction, or I've got to go to the doctor for, you know, some treatment every other day for the next 4 weeks because of my disability, you have to go through a process of deciding whether you can accommodate what they're asking you to do. Now, there has been no litigation. There has been really no sort of pronouncement from the government, state, local, or federal as to whether it is an undue hardship on an employer to allow somebody who's unvaccinated to continue to work in the midst of a vaccine mandate. Probably you're going to have to go through a lot of assessment about what else you can do if this person insists on remaining vaccinated to maintain a healthy and safe workplace before deciding that because this person has a disability and can't be vaccinated that you can let him go. I think it's going to be a rare case where you decide to let somebody go because they're disabled and can't comply with a vaccine mandate. Now, I mean, look, vaccine mandates themselves are, you know, they're growing, there's more, but it's still fairly unusual. So I know most of you guys are probably living in a world that doesn't involve mandates, but that's what we're talking about today. And that's sort of how the disability piece works.
I think as you kind of walked through that, Alex, it really highlights the fact, I mean, this is an issue that plagues employers well before the COVID pandemic, right? This ADA analysis, because we find that like our clients, they want to know the rules. And then if you tell them the rules, they'll follow the rules. And that's what makes it extremely difficult on this ADA. And you start thinking about an accommodation, whether it's for a mandatory vaccine or whether it's for something else that's happening in the workplace, there's not a hard and fast rule. You know, the EEOC says it's an individualized assessment. So then you have to look at the particular facts and circumstances with respect to your workplace, with respect to this employee, and then decide, you know, whether or not the failure to provide this accommodation would be a direct threat to the employee or to others in the workplace. And, you know, I expect we will see some litigation around, you know, this issue, and we'll have some more guidance. You know, for now, you know, what we have, at least from the EEOC, you know, it highlights the exact issues that, you know, we've been talking about, saying the employer needs to look at the workplace environment, the frequency and duration in which the employee is interacting with others, the number of people in the workplace who are partially or fully vaccinated, whether, you know, the employees wearing masks or social distancing would in fact eliminate that direct threat. And so, you know, it's tricky if you get to this point, you have, you know, mandatory vaccines, then certainly it's something, if you have someone come forward with a request for an exemption under the ADA or Title VII for religious reasons, you want to really put on the brakes and carefully weigh through that, you know, as you're looking at it. And we talk about the EEOC because not, you know, the EEOC is certainly not the health agency that says this is a good idea or a bad idea in terms of the vaccine in general. But, you know, the EEOC oversees our federal employment laws. And so they're the ones who are offering some guidance on how this fits in under the ADA and Title VII.
So let me ask you this. What happens when somebody comes in and says, I was at church yesterday and my preacher got up and said that we ought not to be made to take this vaccine, and so I've got a religious objection to your vaccine mandate. What does somebody do with that?
You know, as you were talking through the ADA issues, and I saw, you know, on the screen, the small heads about to explode, as, you know, you think about how in the world do we manage this on an ADA accommodation side? I will step back and take a deep breath and say, Title VII accommodations are just as tricky. I think one thing that you can know when the employee comes in this example and says, I have a religious objection to doing this, is that our courts have said employers are to assume that if an employee comes forward and says this is a sincerely held religious belief, that it is in fact a sincerely held religious belief. And that's really difficult, because when you see this and you say, no, that doesn't make sense. That's not what this particular religion believes, or this isn't in line with the doctrine in which this employee says that he or she follows. It's really not something that can happen under the Title VII analysis. And so employers really are required to say, all right, unless I have some objective basis for believing this employee just isn't being truthful, I can't really ask for additional information on this issue. We're going to have to assume under our legal standard that it is a sincerely held religious belief. But tell them the next step, Alex.
Well, let me ask this about and so then it becomes a question of accommodation. And so can we accommodate somebody's request? And so look, here's the thing, right? We don't know what is going to happen if someone who is unvaccinated comes into the workplace, wears a mask, and life goes on, right? So we don't know that is going to create an adverse outcome for anybody. So how do you prove that it is an unreasonable burden on the employer to allow that to happen when in fact we've largely been operating under that regime pre-vaccines and life has gone on, and we've been telling our employees, come on back to work, it's safe, you'll wear a mask and you'll socially distance. So now an employee comes in and says, I don't want to be vaccinated. I want to wear a mask and socially distance so that I don't have to be vaccinated. And we're saying that's an undue burden on us because it's so unsafe that we can't keep you employed. Like, how do we get away with that?
Yeah, so the standard is different when we look at the ADA and Title VII. It's a different analysis. Employers that are at that point, employers who have gotten to the point and they've said, we are going to mandate vaccines. A lot of this started in the healthcare industry as employers were saying, look, our employees are frontline, they are interacting. You can't social distance when you're working with a patient, a resident of a nursing home, and therefore we really can't take that risk. And that's the easier one to understand when you talk about the risk. And I think the other part of this for non-healthcare companies is looking at this and saying, okay, under Title VII, the employer, the burden's a little different. The employer in a Title VII analysis, when the employees come forward and said, I don't want this vaccine, I can't take this vaccine because of a religious reason, then we have to say, does this cause something more than a de minimis hardship on the employer? And if we can show there's something that's more than de minimis, then you're not required to accommodate that religious request.
All right,
now,
let's stop right there.
With clients, they're still trying to figure out where they're drawing these lines.
All right, let's stop right there. So under disability accommodations, the employer has to show that allowing the individual to come to work unvaccinated would cause a, quote, undue hardship, close quote, on the employer. And under Title VII, the employer only has to show that allowing the individual to come to work unvaccinated would cause more than a, quote, de minimis burden. Is that right? All right,
those are the correct legal terms, Mr. Maultsby. Yes.
Yes, those are the legal terms. Now, what does that mean? Who knows, right? The way that we know how fancy legal words work in operation is because people file lawsuits about it, and courts interpret those words to specific situations. And then people like us say, well, your situation is most like this case where the employer won, or it's most like that case where the employee won. None of this has been litigated. It is a wide open field, right? And so I think we would have to anticipate that an attorney for an employee is going to make the argument that I just made a second ago, right? Which is, how can you say it's an undue burden? The employer is going to say, because we've got a law that says we can mandate vaccines. And if everybody rolls up in here saying that because they went to church on Sunday, they don't have to get vaccinated, I'm not going to be able to have anybody vaccinated, right? And so if I've got 4 out of 5 people on a production line who all come in asking for the same accommodation, suddenly I've got a wholly unvaccinated production line. And that's a burden for me because, and you're going to have some becauses, right? You might have to have some actual examples of people getting sick who weren't vaccinated. You might have to keep tabs on your population of employees to show that there is some risk. And what we see is that our unvaccinated employees are more likely to come down with symptoms than our, right? Like, you got to have some information. I was talking to one manufacturing client the other day who's been keeping an Excel spreadsheet since day 1 of COVID that tracks every last detail of all of this. And they're going to have an awesome data set, right? They're going to be able to say, in fact, he was pointing out to me the other day that what was happening in 2020, summer 2020, was that his data indicated that a positive employee tended to be infecting, spreading virus to 2 others in the same work group. And today, that same positive is tending to spread to 5 workers in the workplace because of the additional contagiousness of this Delta variant. So, you're going to have data, and that's how cases get litigated. But it's a hard, somewhat counterintuitive thing to say that what we've been doing forever is now an undue burden for us to continue to do.
Hey, Alex, I think that's, is you think about what's a practical takeaway from this. I want to pause 1 second because what you said is brilliant. Okay. So as you talk about the data, if you are an employer who is considering mandating vaccines, then it is looking at the data in your workforce and documenting that so that you can say, here's what was going on in the workforce. Here's part of the reason why we needed to do this. The other part, to beef that up, and this is even in guidance that came out from the EEOC and Department of Justice, they say, look to see what the CDC and other health organizations are saying. And I think, part of that is, right now, experts are saying, it's not vaccines alone. It's not mask alone. It's not social distancing alone that's going to stop the spread of the virus. And so I think documenting, if there's a policy where you're going to mandate vaccines, saying, here's why, this is important, this is one aspect, this wasn't available, a year ago. So it's not something employers can do. And, some employers are even tying this to it being approved on a permanent basis. So this is how you can now say, right, this is why it's so important that we're requiring this now when we didn't do it earlier. So here's our explanation for why this is job related and consistent with business necessity. So if you're going down that route, these are just some practical ways to document that so that you can show, if you're ever challenged on that issue, why it is, for your workforce and what's happening in general in terms of the spread in the community. You can tie those together and say, here's our evidence, here's our proof of how we were able to show this is job related and consistent with business necessity.
Yeah, and one thing you can say is the employer who's fighting off this employee who says, how can it be an undue burden when that's how life has worked since the onset of COVID just fine? One answer to that is because we wanted to mandate a vaccine. From day one, we wanted to mandate a vaccine because we believe that is a layer of protection that's important. But of course, we couldn't mandate one that didn't exist. Duh. And then you could say, and we didn't want to mandate one that was only approved for emergency use, but once it was fully approved, then we did what we would have always done, right? So in a weird way, the longer you wait to do a vaccine mandate after, this Pfizer dose has been fully approved, the harder it is to make an argument that, well, of course, we want to see vaccinations for safety purposes. Let me ask a different question. We talked about getting the vaccine process, accommodation process started. We talked about asking about vaccination status. Talk a little bit about, Patti, asking for either vaccine cards, asking for, some proof of vaccination, not just somebody to raise their hand in a group meeting, what you do in terms of keeping that information. You want to hit on that super quick?
Sure. Let me give the easy answer first. If employers want to request a copy of a vaccination card or request proof that an employee has been vaccinated, that's allowed under the law. If you actually obtain copies of the vaccination, know that that is considered confidential, and so it needs to be maintained in a medical file separate from the personnel file. So the easy answer is, from a legal standpoint, yes, you're allowed to request copies, obtain copies, keep them in a safe place once you have it, share it only with people who need to know from a business standpoint. The more difficult question, which I know you really were poking at here, is, how should we do this? And, we've had lots of discussions with clients about this, and, this is affecting, everyone. It's not just, companies with employees, it's companies with patrons who are coming on the premises. Do we want to police that? Do we want to require proof and to see the vaccination card, or are we working on an honor system? And we even saw that roll out right with our governor and the executive order about face mask, more recently, and how, it was, not mandating that, you show proof, but, just saying if you were unvaccinated, you needed to wear a face mask in the prior iteration of the order. And so I think that's where there's not a legal answer to that. And I think as we've seen clients work through that issue, it's more of, a cultural issue. There are some, manufacturing clients who are saying, we can't keep up with who's vaccinated and who's not. And so, we want to make sure that employees feel safe at work. So we're going to request copies of the vaccination cards. We're going to identify that in some way so that supervisors can make sure they are in fact wearing their mask if they're requiring unvaccinated people to wear masks in the workplace. And so employers are really all over the place on that issue. And I'd say, it's certainly more, of a, what's the culture of this company, and what stance do we want to take on that issue?
Can you share your COVID vaccine information on your employees with others outside the organization who have a legitimate need to know? So for example, you might be sending salespeople into somebody else's work environment. It's your customer is super attuned to this issue. Let's say they're in San Francisco, and they say, we want to know and see whether the guy you're sending over here is vaccinated. Can we give that information?
Clients are having to do that now. There are some situations where, customers are saying, we want to make sure the individuals you're sending onto our site are vaccinated. The better option in that situation is not to say, hey, Meredith is vaccinated or not vaccinated. If the customer has that requirement and is imposing that, then just comply with the requirement. Just send people who are vaccinated.
That you can do that. And then if the customer just wants evidence, then, look, it's a little dicey, but what we were saying a minute ago is it's not confidential medical information. So the EOC is like talks out of both sides of their mouth on this a little bit. They say, when you got it, put it in a confidential file. Don't put it in their regular HR file, put it in their medical file. But it's not HIPAA protected. It's not an ADA violation. So you can share it. It just sort of runs counter to what we feel like we've always been counseled to do with medical information. But that's a need to know kind of thing. It's a legitimate business reason for us to tell somebody, yes, our salesperson can come into your workplace. Let's back off of mandatory nature of vaccines a little bit and talk about incentives and disincentives. So are there some incentives that people have seen work? We're going to get some, I think, good polling information from this group based on what Meredith is going to send out. Are there any tricky rules, legal traps, hangups about the world of offering incentives for vaccines?
Of course, right?
Of course.
Incentives are easier in some ways. They're more palpable. It's easier for people to roll out incentives than to mandate the vaccine. But there are certainly some wrinkles that employers need to be aware of. One issue on this. All right, let's go back. We still have, regardless of what we're offering, we still have potential ADA and Title VII issues. So let's think about this. We have a raffle, right? We have some incentive. We're offering a payment, one-time payment, whatever that is. We're offering, it's our carrot. And we want to make this available to employees who want to do this. All right, that goes over really well from an employee morale standpoint the majority of times. But here's the issue. When you have someone who comes forward again and says, well, I want that $500 payment as an incentive for getting the vaccine, but I can't get it because I've got a medical condition that qualifies as a disability under the ADA. And so that's where these incentives become, a little tricky in terms of when you're offering something that is of significant value and it's not going to be available to employees who have some medical condition that qualifies as a disability and keeps them from getting the vaccine, or an employee who has a religious objection and is not getting the vaccine for religious reasons.
So the bottom line on this whole religion disability thing is that in any situation where you're providing a material benefit or you are threatening to impose an adverse employment action, right? So if you've got a carrot or a stick, you can't exclude disabled people and religious objectors, although we could maybe be a little easier on the religious objection side because the law is a little bit less burdensome on the employer. But you cannot exclude those people from the world of folks who might get the carrot. And you can't beat those people with the stick because they might have a good excuse to not be in the group that you want to impose the adverse employment action on. So in all of this, it is almost impossible to get away from having to consider these disability-related, religious-related accommodation questions. I would say that you don't have to necessarily advertise them as part of discussing incentives like a drawing or a lottery or a payment, a one-time payment. But, you know, if you want to be a good, sophisticated employer, you might think about, well, what's an alternative thing that I can do, or that I can have a disabled person do, that is an indication on their part that they buy into this and they're with us on safety issues. And if they'll do those things, put their name in the hat too. It's just hard to get away from these accommodation issues. One crazy thing that we've seen with regard to actual dollar winnings is the following. So if you've got non-exempt employees who work overtime, then the overtime that they're entitled to be paid is 1.5 times what's called their regular rate of pay. Their regular rate of pay is not just their base compensation, but is all of their compensation divided by the number of hours they work. So if there's a production bonus or there's some other form of payment on top of an hourly rate, all that gets thrown in when you calculate what their overtime rate is. There's some case law out there that says if you tell employees that if they do the following thing, they will be eligible for a drawing in the amount of $500, and then they go do that thing and they win the drawing, that the $500 has to be included in calculating what their regular rate of pay is, so that you know how much you have to pay them in overtime. Now, I'll tell you that if you, over the course of, you know, incentivizing COVID vaccines, wind up with 5, 8, 10 employees who, you know, get a winning like this, I wouldn't worry about that too much, frankly. If you want to be technically compliant, then we should probably talk offline about how all that might work in your own workplace. The way that that's been litigated is when large employers have had very, you know, frequent, consistent incentive programs like that, and a plaintiff's lawyer comes along and does a class action case where each individual is entitled to $4.62 over the course of a year because this wasn't calculated correctly, but the attorney walks away with a bunch of attorney's fees. So, you know, in a sort of just a few people, that's a technical legal trap. I don't know that it's that big a motivator because it is an administrative hassle to do. And employees probably don't understand it anyway, and they're glad to get the $500. But it's a weird little twist, frankly.
Alex, can you talk a little bit about masks? I saw a couple of questions. I just wanted to get this one in there real quick about masks being an acceptable accommodation. For those that request an exception to a mandated policy, for example, or you know, I know we mentioned also mask being a hardship or undue hardship. Can you just give us a little bit of guidance on that?
Yeah, so here's how, well, a couple things. You know, one, we've got state and local rules around masks. So we always have to comply with that as its own independent issue about mask wearing indoors in the presence of others. And there are exceptions for certain things that happen in workplaces occasionally. But for the most part, you know, number one on masks, do what those state and local rules require. Number two is this question, I think, goes to if somebody says, I'm not going, well, masks are, there's a lot of issues about masks. Let's start with the masks as it relates to vaccine mandates. So the way that would come up is somebody says, I don't want to be vaccinated, but I'm happy to wear a mask. And we would say either, okay, if you're not going to be vaccinated, you have to wear a mask, and everybody goes off on their own, and that's how life works. Or we say, sorry, wearing a mask is not safe enough. We insist that you be vaccinated. And then the question that is, well, is that if their, you know, inability to be vaccinated is based on a disability and that's why they're doing the mask, right? Then, you know, is it an undue hardship on the employer from a safety standpoint to allow somebody to come to work masked as opposed to vaccinated? And that's going to be a hard case to prove, we think, based on what we've discussed earlier. The other issue with masks is if somebody comes in around the vaccine and just says, well, hey, how about if instead of being vaccinated, I just decide to wear a mask? We don't have to do that unless their reason is based on the existence of a disability or a religious objection that gives them a legal right not to be vaccinated. We can say, nope, we're not relying on masks, we want vaccines. You know, I don't know the data, frankly, on whether it's safer to be vaccinated or to be masked. It might be safer to be masked than to be vaccinated, right? So we, you know, all that fits into the accommodation piece. If you want to impose a mask mandate, you can do that. And, you know, like we've done that, right? That can happen. There can be situations where an employee says, I've got a disability that prevents me from wearing a mask. And then you got to work through all these same issues around whether there's something you can do for that employee to excuse them from having to wear a mask, social distancing, etc. Patti, what else am I not thinking of with regard to mask wearing?
I think that's right. You know, I think this is where looking at what the experts are currently saying about this, you know, and how does that fit in your workplace, right? I mean, there was an article that came out last week about a teacher in California. They had mandated masks, teacher was wearing masks. She brought the mask down while she was reading to the students. It ended up like every student on the first 2 rows ended up being infected. And, you know, there's this whole study about how all that spread. And so I think that's part of the reason why, right, employers are saying, you know, in some situations, you can't have your mask on all the time. And if, you know, you're not able to social distance, if the ventilation isn't such, you know, these are just individual calls that are going to have to be made around this issue. Certainly, there are times when wearing a mask is going to be an acceptable accommodation to getting the vaccine. There are other times and situations in which employers are going to be able to say, just wearing a mask is not enough, and we're mandating the vaccine for that reason.
Before we close, I want to make sure we talk about one thing, and then we'll wrap up or take any remaining questions. So last week, news came out that Delta Airlines was going to impose higher employee insurance costs for individuals who are not vaccinated. So if you're not vaccinated, your employee share of the premiums was going to go up $200 a month. So naturally, everybody starts thinking, oh, well, that's interesting. Maybe we should do that. So anytime you put your toe into the water of insurance programs, you are dealing with a host of complicated laws. You have ERISA, you have the Affordable Care Act, you have the IRS. It is a quagmire. So, you know, don't just haul off and do that. Talk to your insurance brokers about what they're seeing in the market, whether that is a possibility, what they think the risks are around that. I'll tell you that from just a threshold legal deal, Delta Airlines has an exemption because of something called the National Railway Labor Act. They're not a railroad, obviously, but it applies to sort of common carriers of people. And so they have an exemption from the Affordable Care Act. Why is that important? The Affordable Care Act says you can't base your premiums on sort of the way people are, right? That's the whole thing about pre-existing conditions. You can't charge somebody $1,000 a month just because they're diabetic. So it appears to us from doing some research based on the flurry of questions around this Delta Airlines thing that you can't just do that. So the Affordable Care Act says you can vary premiums based on factors related to age. That's a little complicated, but you can kind of do it. And based on tobacco use. Now, if the Affordable Care Act was being written today, I guarantee you that there would be a large segment of Congress and then the White House for sure would put something in there that says you can change your premiums based on somebody's vaccination status, but it's not in there. The EEOC, the DOJ, the IRS, none of them have come out and said that that's an okay thing to do. So the other way toward it is that some people are thinking about making vaccines part of your wellness program, right? So if you got a wellness program, you check all the boxes as an employee, you do your steps, you take your biometric readings, all the things, then you get a discount on your premiums. Question is, well, can we add and be vaccinated in order to get the discount on the premiums? And the answer is yes, you can do that, but you're still going to have to do, again, all this carrot stuff. You're still going to have to do all the assessments about whether you have to let disabled people qualify, disabled people who thereby can't be vaccinated based on the note of their doctor, right? Whether you have to still allow them to achieve the maximum wellness program benefit by doing something else that might be safety related. So it's hard to get away from this accommodation stuff and this idea of, you know, incentives that we've talked about, and the idea of disincentives, right, which would be what making your health insurance more expensive would be. You still can't get away from these ADA and religious objection issues. So, you know, broadly speaking, that's kind of where the outlines are. There's going to be litigation, but the litigation is going to happen in 2026 about things that happened in 2022. And by then, it's going to be too late to take much guidance from it. Hopefully, COVID will be, you know, the seasonal flu by then. We may still be dealing with vaccinations the same way we do with flu shots, but hopefully, you know, short of everybody having to mandate vaccines, we'll get to a point where these variants subside a little bit and we can get back to life as normal. We've got 2 more minutes, and I know that it's important with this group to stay on target, and we certainly want to do that. We are also happy to hang around for a few minutes after to continue to answer some questions, understand everybody jumping off as they please. And then, as Meredith said, she's got our contact information. And so we are also, you know, completely happy to follow up afterwards. This is a super important, but admittedly super nebulous area of HR management right now. And you may feel like, well, that was fun and that was nice. And I loved looking at how puke green the wall behind Alex turned out to be with the light bulb that he changed. But I'm more confused than I was at 8:59. And while that was fun, boy, is it a mess. And we're happy to try to continue to unwind the messes for you going forward. So thanks to everybody. Patti, any final words?
No, these were great questions. I know we've been able to hit on some of them. Meredith, is there anything else you want us to tackle as we're wrapping up?
Well, I will, since I know there were a couple of questions, you all did an excellent job answering questions through the chat and back and forth with one another. This was so super informative, and we learned a lot. I've already been getting lots of great compliments of your presentation this morning. So I will offer the ability to hang out for 5 more minutes with Patti and Alex if they have 5 minutes. I know their time is very busy right now as well from some additional questions. Otherwise, we will share the recording of this presentation. And you can also always email me some questions, and maybe I can get some basic information and share it back out with you from Alex and Patti. You have their contact information as well in the chat. So with that, we will hold for 5 minutes for some additional questions, and we appreciate all of you who spent an hour with us this morning. We look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Give it a minute or two. I did see a couple of questions about, do you foresee that all businesses will eventually be required to mandate vaccination? And I know that's a crystal ball question, but we've heard a couple in the news recently. Do you see that progressing?
I think that there will be some super progressive local jurisdictions that try to do that. I think that most authorities understand that there are so many accommodation issues. There are so many ways for people to raise their hand and avoid a vaccine that mandating it is just going to be a nightmare, right? like an individual employer can mandate it, but from a PR standpoint, being the politician who votes that everybody has to mandate it, I just don't see it happening.
I think more of that will be driven by what are your competitors doing? And, as we've seen in certain industries, we've seen certain concert venues and, different places, airlines that are mandating masks. And, certainly from an industry standpoint, it's much easier to do that when, the other companies similar to you are doing that. So I think that'll continue to drive some of what we see in this area, rather than it being imposed from a government level.
Thank you, Patty. I can see a question in the chat. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, especially, in terms of a broad mandate across all business communities, I don't see that happening.
Thanks. It looks like we work in HVAC and have medical facilities that are now requiring our folks to be vaccinated in order to work on their sites. They're also requiring all of their staff to be as well. Any thoughts on this?
They can do it, and they can require it of you. And they can require you to provide evidence that you're complying with their mandate. How they require that is sort of up to them. But, it's a little bit like what we talked about with regard to a salesperson going into somebody else's workplace, vendors, salespeople. So they can do it. And, it's up to them to make the assessment of whether imposing that mandate is going to cause them not to be able to get their AC serviced because they can't find enough companies who can provide fully vaccinated employees. That's a quick response. What else do you think, Patti?
Oh, no, that's exactly right. If you're the HVAC employer, then you have to then look at, can I assign this employee to other locations, right? Non-healthcare or other companies that are not requiring the vaccination, and try to make that assessment.
I have one more here. How about any ramifications for requiring regular COVID testing for your employees?
It's been pretty well accepted as something that can be part of a reasonable accommodation request. And, I think where employers are really more struggling with that issue is, are we going to continue to pay for it, or are we going to require employees to pay for that if they're not getting vaccinated, and that's part of a vaccination accommodation?
When we're talking about disincentives in the nature of increased premiums, a disincentive that Patti and I were talking about yesterday that we think is legal, doesn't mean it's a great idea, but we think it's legal. It's exactly what she just said. If you're not going to be vaccinated, then you've got to be tested once a week, so we know you're not positive, and you got to pay for it. So you could do that. That would be a disincentive. And look, that sounds harsh, but the thing that's going on with this Delta variant is freaking scary. I mean, it's terrible. And we've gotten all sort of, a little bit desensitized to this a little bit, but man, then when you drop back and you look at what's happening right now, like, it's bad. And so, look, if you don't want to be vaccinated, cool, we're not going to say you're fired, but you got to do the thing that you now got to do, and you got to pay for it. Now, right, we started with labor shortage, can't run off all your employees, so that's a given, but still, if you're looking for a disincentive, then maybe that's a place to consider.
And sometimes that's just an extra expense the employer doesn't want to take on, because it can get really expensive quickly. And even if it's not from, I'm trying to penalize this employee because they're not getting the vaccine, in reality, right, someone is going to have to pay the cost of the test.
And I had a discussion with somebody last week. They were like, look, man, we have incentivized to the end of the earth. We've given away more stinking money to get people to like take this reasonable health measure, and we're at wit's end. Like, we've done it. And Furthermore, COVID, we had a terrible year. We don't have stacks of money sitting around to do this with, and we got to find a way to create some disincentives, where if you want to be brutal, some penalties for folks who won't get vaccinated and thereby continue to come to work, creating more risk for us. So I think, just to sum it up, that's where most people in this area are, not mandating because they're worried about running off employees, but it's around these margins of incentives and disincentives. And there's some interesting creative things. Certainly people who are doing HR every day, doing safety every day, managing companies, have far more creative ideas than the two of us do. And kudos to people for being so encouraging to folks to try to do the right thing.
That's right. Carrie, I see you have a question. Thank you for pushing that back up real quick. He says our company presently charges, this is a manufacturing company, a different rate for smokers than for non-smokers. We make employees sign a smoking and non-smoking affidavit. Can we do that with vaccinations?
Yeah, good question. So tobacco use is one factor that when the Affordable Care Act came out, the law said you could take into account in setting premiums. And so that does not violate the Affordable Care Act. We think that it would violate the Affordable Care Act to increase premiums based on a factor that the Affordable Care Act does not specifically say you can take into account. And since it doesn't say you can take vaccination status into account, granted there was no COVID vaccine controversy back then, or they might have included it, but they didn't. And so we think setting premiums based on vaccinated status, if you're governed by the Affordable Care Act, which most people are, but not everybody, paren C Delta Airlines, not covered, then I think you probably can't just do that. It's going to be interesting, so like this is a question that's going to come up across the country, right? Everybody read the article, it's across the country. And so insurance companies, plan writers, the people who work in those roles in the regulatory world in DC, third-party administrators, like everybody's going to get attuned to this, and that could change, but as life stands right now, that's the answer.
Okay. I'll take these last two questions that are in the chat, and then please feel free to email me questions after this, and I'm happy to just assemble a small document of any additional questions. So what liability, thank you, Jeff, does a company assume if they mandate vaccines and an employee has a severe adverse reaction to the vaccine?
It's really a negligible issue, right? Somebody can file a lawsuit at any time. So we know that, right? There's no threshold. No one's looking over the merits of a claim before it gets filed. But keep in mind, this is where it's important. There are different rules if you are the employer that is administering the vaccine. And so it is much cleaner and easier if you're sending the employee to a third party, right? You're saying, go get this at CVS, at Walgreens, anywhere they're doing vaccinations, come back and show us the card. It's much cleaner from that standpoint.
If you had somebody have a severe adverse reaction that they could tie to the vaccine and you had made them get that shot in order to be eligible to work, then they might have a workers' compensation claim for that, right? It would require getting a doctor to line up and say that that's what happened and that was their adverse effect. There's no independent liability, like they can't sue you and say, you owe me punitive damages and you owe me for pain and suffering and all. It would only be, within the world of workers' compensation, because their whole argument would be, this happened to me because of my job. This is an injury that I sustained, in the course and scope of employment. Yes, it wasn't while I was at work, but it was because work sent me off to make this happen. But, adverse reactions that go beyond a day of feeling kind of puny are really, really, really rare.
And keep in mind, Alex is exactly right on that. I will say, you don't make people get the vaccine, and it's still, ultimately it might feel like that to the employee, but it is still, the employee will sign whatever disclaimers and waivers when they go to get the vaccine from the provider who's giving that to them. And so they do have a choice if you mandate it, whether to stay and work for you or not. So, that's part of the reason there's not really the liability issue on that. And I think definitely there could be a workers' comp claim filed out of that, but the ability to establish that under our North Carolina laws would be extremely difficult, that, especially as other companies are mandating as well.
And, the bigger risk, frankly, is that somebody gets COVID at work, can prove it. So for a long time, we're like, look, don't worry about these workers' comp claims. Nobody's going to be able to prove that they got it at work as opposed to got it at the grocery store. Just carry on. And I think as contact tracing, becomes more abundant, and as this Delta variant is so much more contagious, it's going to be easier for people at least to get sort of a threshold showing of causation, right? I got it because I was at work. If they can show that, 5 people who worked together all got sick at the same time based on one of them reporting COVID symptoms 4 days before all the rest of them did. And, if you get somebody like that who goes to the hospital and is in ICU on a ventilator and dies, I mean, now you got some real workers' comp, right? So it's sort of pick the side of that you want to be on.
All right, let's get this last question. I'm gonna let y'all get back to work, because this is making me nervous that you're on this call and not and not dealing with all these issues. Daryl says, we allow first responders at our company, I'm not sure what company this is yet, but to decline the hepatitis vaccine and remain in that role. Would that impact such a mandate for COVID vaccine?
I don't think it has any real impact on whether you can do that or not. And in part, it's right, because what CDC medical experts are saying is COVID's different. Declining the hepatitis vaccine affects the employee who's not getting it, whereas the COVID vaccine, they're saying it doesn't just affect that individual. Being vaccinated helps protect the employees and others around him or her. So I think that's the real distinction in some of these vaccines.
Okay. All right, let's wrap this. Thank you for spending 15 extra minutes with us. I'm thrilled, and that was generous of you and your time. Again, folks, please feel free to email me, email Alex and Patti, and we appreciate you so much sharing your insight and your guidance with us today. And we will see you all on the next Manufacturing Council, which will be on the 23rd this month.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so
Meredith.
much. All right, thanks.